Hello there. I'm not quite sure when this episode will come up onto the site, but as explained, we're in that period where I'm finishing a book, and then I know I'm going to collapse like a wet rag at the end of it. So as this one's being delivered early, so we're not quite in the normal routine of things, but I'm still hoping to get something out every week. So every Wednesday, ideally, there should be a video of some sort. Anyway, this one's continuing our Conquered and the Proud series, and today we're going to be looking at the Roman invasion of Britain and some of the aftermath for the next few decades. So it ties in very much with the talks on the Julio-Claudians, particularly the Julio-Claudians and the Empire, and it will lead on as well to some future stuff about the Roman army, Hadrian's Wall, frontiers, that sort of thing as well. So it'll tie in with other stuff we're doing as well as with the Conquered and the Proud series. So it fits very much within that. Now, there is a reaction. I remember one of the first lectures I ever had as an undergraduate, the then Professor of Roman History at Oxford, emphasising to us that a lot, he was expecting many of us to have come there because we got excited about Roman Britain, we got excited about archaeological sites near where we lived, and sorry, I think there's a shine on my glasses. I'm not sure I can do very much about that. We'll have to see. Maybe that's helped a little bit. No, I don't think so. Apologies for that. That might just be the light today, so you'll just have to have the glint in the Goldsworthy eye, I'm afraid, because if I take the glasses off, then I can't see whether the camera's working properly, but I'm not sure I'll be able to make out my notes either. And this is something that I can 90% do from memory, but it's nice to have that other 10% of coverage. Anyway, he argued very much that we should downplay Roman Britain. Forget that, look at the wider picture. This is a very large empire that's there for a very long time. Roman Britain is on the fringes, it's not the most important province. And there's a lot of truth in that, and it was a useful thing to remind yourself at that stage where you're coming from, oh yeah, there's this Roman site near me, there's this one, oh, Hadrian's Wall, this is really exciting, and all this sort of thing. However, he went a little bit too far, and that was partly a reflection of his particular research interests at the time that tended to be much more on the political, social aspects of things. Roman Britain's important in several ways, and that's why it's worth devoting an episode to it. First thing is that it's one of the most major conquests that occurs in this period and really under the Principate. By the time you get to the 2nd century, you'll have Trajan in Dacia. But before that, for the 1st century AD, Britain is really the big deal. Well, there's Augustus chipping in. We'll get some quotes from him, the real one, not the cat. Well, we'll possibly get some quotes from the cat as well as we go along. But it's a big deal. It's a major thing. Claudius will name his son Britannicus. Obviously, Nero will have thoughts about that, and Britannicus isn't going to succeed him for very long, but nevertheless, that's the idea. So you could have had an emperor with that title. So that's one thing. It is a break in that pattern of essentially consolidating the frontiers, starting to sort of settle down, build these frontier systems as we discern them. Again, look at the Grand Strategy series. We'll be getting onto this sort of thing. How the Romans see things is a source of much and often rather frenzied debate. But it is a big deal. It's a major break in that pattern, and it's something, as we'll see, Claudius bothered to get to Britain, only for a few days, but he was here for 10 days, maybe 14 at the most, to be there at the kill, to be there at the big surrender of the local kings, queens and princes, when the tribes of the southeast effectively threw in the towel. So it's a big deal for him propaganda-wise, and again we'll come on to that because that's significant in explaining why this all happens. But it is also worth remembering that Britain becomes one of the major military provinces of the Roman Empire. So on the one hand we can say there's no direct evidence for a Roman senator ever being produced by Britain. So the Romans are here for 350 years. Most provinces, they'll start to send men to the Senate before too long. As far as we know, Britain never does. Another comparison in terms of prosperity and tangible remains. I remember working, very briefly, I was mostly carrying equipment and walking up and down in a field, Samogatuza Ulpia in Romania, and we'll look at that more when we get on to Trajan and the Dacian Wars, and we'll look at some pictures of that site, which is well worth visiting if you're ever in the area. It's probably not promoted as much as a tourist site as it should be, but there's a lot there. I think from that one city, talking to the archaeologists, they'd found almost 1,000 carved inscriptions, mostly in Latin, a few in Greek. I'm not quite sure what the total now is for Roman inscriptions in Britain, but it's probably struggling to reach 2,000 altogether. That's found from a whole province rather than just one city. There are other cities in Roman Dacia where there's almost as much found. Now, it's probably partly a reflection of Britain being much more heavily developed and built over in subsequent centuries, so a lot of good Roman stone inscriptions have simply been reused. It's also a reflection that perhaps they were using other materials that don't survive, and that's that the great problem with archaeology is we see what survives and we concentrate on things like pottery because it breaks into pieces, but those pieces are, for the experts, fairly easy to identify, and then you can trace patterns of trade and all this sort of thing. Same thing isn't true of wooden barrels that might be carrying just as much, if not more material, but only survive in very rare circumstances. And when they do, there's not much to typology with them. You can divide them up into different groups. So in some respects, Britain doesn't become a really wealthy province until comparatively late. On the other hand, we'll see the invasion force later on, but for most of the period, there are at least 3 Roman legions stationed in Britain. And they are reinforced by a comparable or probably larger number of auxiliary troops. Britain becomes one of the 3 top postings with Syria, with Pannonia. There's no coincidence that in the civil war that breaks out after the murder of Pertinax, following the murder of Commodus, it's the governors of these provinces that become the main candidates for the throne because they've got the biggest armies. It's no coincidence somebody like Constantine is going to be proclaimed emperor in York and be able to do it. A lot of troops means this is politically very sensitive and very important. It's also a plum posting for an ambitious senator. Later on, the province will be divided by Septimius Severus into 2, so you'll have 2 governors' positions, one of them in charge of 2 legions, one of them possibly combining the job with being legatus of the single legion, depends on the period. But that means at the very least there's 4 senators in Britain at any one time. With 3 legions, you've got a senatorial tribune, a broad-striped tribune who's aspiring to be a senator. So a lot of the Senate passes through Britain at some point in their career, and particularly the high flyers because of that military connection. So the idea of Britain as on the margins, wet and cold and unpleasant, and nobody really thought about it very much, is a gross exaggeration, a distortion. It does register in the Roman mindset, in the experience of the lives of these ambitious senators. Now, again, that will change in the 3rd century AD with the political changes that mean that senators become less and less significant, eventually drop out of military and provincial commands altogether. So there is an element where Britain does really matter in the empire. It is a significant province. It isn't on the fringe. So yes, we shouldn't emphasize it too much because I'm British, and it's one of the reasons I got interested in the Romans was that sense they'd come to my home. I could go and I could climb over, crawl over Roman remains in a way that I couldn't with Greek, Egyptian, that sort of thing. Fascinating though those cultures are, it simply didn't seem so immediate to me, particularly when I was young. So there is that element. Roman Britain is everything. It's clearly not everything, but it isn't utterly insignificant. You mustn't push things to the other extreme. So it's important for our context because it's a big change, a big conquest in this period where conquests are so rare, and it becomes a very significant military concern, and that means it's a big political concern within the empire. So let's step back from that and let's look more closely at Roman relations with Britain. Britain is very much on the fringes of the world. The Romans are aware of the 3 continents of Europe, Africa, and Asia, and they talk about, the wider sea around. So even though educated people understand that the world is a globe, they don't, and they've got, if you've really bothered to look, there are scholars in Alexandria that have calculated the circumference of the Earth pretty accurately. So the very learned have some idea of the planet of the size as we appreciate it, but beyond that, in another sense, there's less idea of what's out there. There are only these 3 continents, and Britain is an island that's off the coast. So it's in the sea that encircles the world that sort of fills up all the rest with just sea, just water, just nothingness. So it's a little bit mysterious. Julius Caesar lands there in 55 BC. The expedition is probably thrown off a little bit by events, problems in Gaul beforehand, and it turns into a fairly small thing of less than 2 months. You know, he's here really a matter of weeks. Small scale, he only comes with 2 legions, but there is fighting, there is negotiation. He returns on a larger scale in 54 BC, and a substantial number of tribes submit to him, you know, make this show of submitting to him and to Rome. Obviously, Caesar presents all of this as wholly within the interest of the Republic. The tribes become tributary and presumably promise to pay this. Whether they actually do or not, or if they do, for how long they do, very hard to say. You know, later on Tacitus will say that Caesar sort of showed the province to the Romans rather than actually taking it. It's listed in the Res Gestae, the deeds of the divine Augustus, as part of the empire. But then, you know, in effect, so is India. Augustus is shooting a line in this as to how great we are. And it's this concept of Roman imperium, Roman power. The idea is that these are areas that have experienced us, are aware of us, are aware of our great strength, our majesty, and have behaved in a suitably humble way. So we're coming back to the conquered and the proud. You know, these are the humble. These are not the proud. They respect us, therefore they're part of our empire. They respect our imperium. They're within our power. Not that we actually want them to do anything, therefore there's no source of friction, but nevertheless, that's within it. So in a certain sort of way, it talks about that. You have the excited poems from Horace talking about Augustus will become a god when he adds the Britons and the Parthians to our empire. We've quoted this before. He doesn't. There are a couple of occasions where leaders from Britain lose out in power struggles, civil wars in their homeland, flee to the Roman Empire. They're well received, they're well treated, they're looked after by the empire, but any call they made to come on in and help me, put me back into power, that is ignored. Augustus does not take this opportunity. Diplomatic activity is certainly possible. It's not going to leave much in the way of a trace. There has been a major shift you can see in trade patterns from before Caesar to afterwards. So it's one of the reasons why Caesar is involved with the Veneti, this maritime tribe on the west coast of Gaul. The impression is, if you look at sites like Hengistbury Head that are not to the west, but they're further along from the sort of southeast, the Kent, the London, that area. That seems to have been one of the major ports for trade before Caesar, and an awful lot of stuff is coming in. And one of the reasons when Julius Caesar asks traders about, what information can you tell me about Britain, about the politics, about landing places, all this sort of thing, he doesn't get much in the way of information. Most of the trade seems to be in the hands of merchants from Gaul. Now, they might be taking Roman goods on and taking them in, and you can certainly see luxury goods, wine amphorae, crop up. Now, again, we come back to the problem mentioned earlier. Something like an amphora is incredibly distinctive, and pottery, it shatters, but you find the bits and you can identify the bits. So it's much easier to trace than other things. The impression is that it's the luxury goods that are really coming from far afield. Now, there might be other things as well. You can trace, there's a huge export of Italian wine into Gaul from the late 2nd century BC into the 1st century BC, before Caesar. Vast quantities of this, these prestigious goods. And Caesar talks about the Aedui and the Sequani, bickering over controlling the trade and the tolls levied on it along the River Rhone and this sort of thing. So it's a big deal. Those rivers have dredged up the Rhone, the Saône, these vast quantities of amphorae. And given that this is the stuff that's lost, there's an awful lot that's going through. So a lot's happening. It has that culture of it's prestigious, this is for the aristocracy, this is for the royal families, this is for the leaders, and it fits in with this culture of showing off, of communal dining, feasting, all this sort of thing that you get in these broad depictions of Latin Iron Age society in different respects. So it's fitting in with part of that. It's very much for the elite. This is not mass trading where the goods are for fairly ordinary people. This is generally something of the wealthy. That will shift. After Caesar, you start to get sites like that fade away. They get less and less coming through them, and instead you have an emphasis on the southeast. The area where Caesar has been, the area where Caesar has negotiated, the area where supposedly tribes are tributary now. There's more trade coming in, and it'll start to, there are some signs you can interpret it different ways, that you might even get a colony of merchants at what will become Londinium before the Roman army arrives. But there's certainly far more stuff is coming in, though it still tends towards the luxury items. And it's coming in to the southeast, and the impression overwhelmingly is that now you have Roman or Gallo-Roman traders doing this. So it's something that's been brought. So it's a big leap to say Caesar is operating and working on behalf of business interests. On the other hand, they clearly profit from what's going on. So you get contact. It is not on the moon. However, there's an interesting passage when Tacitus, writing early 2nd century, talks about one of the expeditions under Germanicus around Germany. A fleet is caught in a storm. Some of the ships are blown all the way to Britain and end up landing there. And when the soldiers and sailors return, they have these wild stories of creatures that are half beast, half human, all this sort of thing. There's an element where you get those wild stories about the New World, all those famous engravings and things that they'll show of people with their faces and their chests and no head and all that sort of thing. There's that sort of sense of something a bit. So Britain still maintains some mystique, because it's not quite real. It's the fringes of the proper world, and strange things might occur there. But there is more contact. Now, Caligula is supposed to have considered an invasion, and we'll come on to that in a bit more detail, but it actually happens under Claudius. That's 43, that's nearly a century after Julius Caesar. Now, obviously, there's a lot of archaeology from Britain, and that will be the bulk of our evidence, backed by what literary sources there are. It doesn't appear much in the literature, and it's frustrating that parts of Tacitus' Annals, for instance, that would talk about the actual Claudian invasion, that's lost. Some of the other things that might mention it. So you get later on Historia Scapula, it sort of kicks off about there, resumes. You have Agricola later on, his biography of his father-in-law, who was governor of Britain in the late 70s, 80s. So you get those, and we're very lucky. Without those, we would know far, far less. You've got people like Dio, sometimes in full, sometimes in epitome, talking about other things. The evidence in the literature is patchy for the 1st century AD and almost non-existent afterwards. You just get these little cameos, really, where a bit of information appears, and sometimes it's not in the best of sources. A little bit for the 4th, but very, very little. So we have those problems of how we're trying to understand that there's a lot we don't know. But again, it's worth looking at this because it reminds us of, well, how do we fit together what we have from the archaeology, what we have from the literature, and try and understand. So let's look at Britain before the Romans arrive. We're obviously in the Iron Age. It's divided into tribes. Some people get terribly worked up when you use expressions like Celtic. The La Tène culture, that's clearly dominant in most areas, though there are variations and some exceptions. Ultimately, the languages do seem to be part of the broader Celtic family. Just how far you can push that, and how far you can take something where a geographer talks about this is what the Gauls do, you can say that that's probably also the case in Britain. Caesar presents the Britons and the Gauls as similar but not quite identical. So they have relations, and he claims that Britons have come to fight on the side of the Gauls against Romans, this sort of thing, this implication of involvement. He talks about a king of northwestern Gaul that's also had territory in Britain and all this sort of thing. And there are similarities of some tribal names and enough culture. I mean, there's this peculiarity that the Britons seem to build round. Their houses are classic round houses. On the continent, you like rectangles. Quite why there's that divide. The idea of the round house seems to go back a long way in Britain. So it might just be this is something where people have worked out, well, this really works and this is functional, and then they get used to it. It's the natural way. In the same way, you ask a child to draw a house, probably still the case that they'll draw that sort of square with the V, the arched roof or the V-shaped roof, door, 3 or 4 windows, chimney, smoke coming out of the chimney. that's sort of programmed into us, that sense of what a house is. It might be changing now when things look a little bit different. That was certainly the case for a long time. So you have that sense, and you do get these traditions that develop. Now, there were these traditions that, again, Victorians and early 20th century people tend to buy into, of successive waves of invaders, the Boudica folk and others coming through, that would lead up to the Belgic tribes in the southeast that are connected to the Belgic tribes of the northern Gaul. And the idea of waves of invaders that would supplant or enslave, or in some cases, basically eradicate the existing population and take over, and you get these changes in languages, in culture, and all this sort of thing. That's not been fashionable for such a long time, though it might well come back again. I think attitudes to migration are changing because, as somebody, one wall scholar said to me a while back in the had to bump into each other in the library. This was during the height of the the floods of migrants coming into Europe and coming through the borders. He said, well, perhaps we need to rethink this. For a long time, archaeologists got into this mindset that people didn't move around, or that only very small numbers would, and that basically they just change their culture. They get influenced by outside and all this sort of thing. And it ties in particular, it's probably even more controversial in in inverted commas, but very small writing, when you're talking about the post-Roman, the Angles, the Saxons, the Frisians, people like that. What's happening there? I think it's probably somewhere in the middle. There's a mixture where there are large migrant groups that move around. It's not that far, and even crossing the Channel, whilst problematic, is perfectly possible. And we know that trade's been going on for a long time. And again, recent discoveries have been emphasizing just how important tin from Cornwall in the southwest and other sections of the southwest and parts of Wales were for the wider Bronze Age in the Mediterranean and beyond, because it's a rare resource and it's what people needed, and it was worth traveling all that way to get. So there's probably a mixture. People do move around, but there are also cases where you simply have a warlord and his warriors come in and take over. The name changes, maybe the language changes. Right, I've been trying out a new microphone, and a couple of times it's failed on me, so I've ended up with half hour, 40 minutes or more of me just doing the silent movie bit of mouthing but with no sound recorded, which means I've lost quite a lot of this talk, so I'm doing this bit again to fit in and hopefully piece together while it's some coherent. But there might be some bits where I've missed things out or I repeat myself because I'm doing this the next day. So we talked really about this old idea of sort of waves of invaders. Whether that's true or not, again, a difficult one to say, perhaps a mixture. Basically, the pattern you have before the Romans arrived is a centralised, more united tribes. The Cacciaviloni, Trinovantes north of the Thames, under King Conobalinus later in the 1st century BC become united, dominate those around them. Cymbeline from Shakespeare, not that the play bears much relation to him because we don't know anything about him. Most of this we trace from names on coins. It's another sign of a Roman influence that they're minting coins and they're putting slogans on with king's names. He's succeeded by 2 of his sons, Caraticus and Togodumnus, who appear to rule together, or at least in some form of alliance. They drive out another brother called Adminius. Later on they drive out a chap called Verica, king of the Regenses, or Regnenses, sorry, or one of the kings perhaps. Berica he's called in Dio. There's a lot of emphasis on their power. Perhaps they're monopolising trade. A lot of trade is now coming in through the southeast rather than from the sort of the west, the Hengistbury Head, that area. Again, I can't remember if I've talked about this or not. I certainly did, but whether it's something that's been lost when the sound went, I don't know. There are signs of trading, sort of a trading community, a predecessor to Londinium probably is there before the Romans actually invade. And there may be connections elsewhere with people like Verica and others, and there's debates over Fishbourne and some of these sites whether actually some of it's built before the Claudian invasion, because you have leaders that have good deals with the Romans, are friendly to the Romans and like the idea of Roman lifestyle.
Not unprecedented elsewhere. You know, the Tacitus talks about a villa that's well outside Roman territory that they come across during a campaign. People want to live that way. Elsewhere, you generally say people are less united. The Iceni seem to have several different kings. Dorotriges, Dorset, that area. This is real hill fort country. Maiden Castle, Hambledon Hill, Hod Hill, this sort of thing. Strong walled settlements suggest lots of centres of power rather than one central authority. It's the same way you look at the Norman conquest post 1066. Kings tended to restrict castle building within England very tightly and wanted as many as possible under royal control. Come to somewhere like Wales, you've got Chepstow Castle early on, and later on, as they almost freelance, the barons there, and because they're allowed to. The king doesn't have the time, the effort, the energy to expand into Wales or subsequently Ireland. It's done by local leaders who build their own strongholds because they're allowed to be more independent and for their own security. So it suggests lots of leaders rather than some. In the north, you've got the Brigantes, perhaps a confederation, a group rather than an individual tribe. Queen Cartimandua is famous. Some evidence coming out that some of the peoples of the north were wealthier than we tended to think in the past. Anyway, let's look at the Claudian invasion. So the big question, obviously, is why does Claudius decide to send more than a tenth of the Roman army, something like an eighth of the entire Roman army, to go and attack Britain? Several possibilities of this. The official reason, the pretext, is an appeal from Verica, this king who's been expelled by the Catuvellauni Trinovantes under Caratacus and Togodumnus, for help. He claims to be a friend, an ally of Rome, and wants protection. This is a classic Roman justification for war. You know, it's Hannibal and Saguntum, it's Caesar in so many cases in Gaul. A friend of ours has been picked on by enemies. To demonstrate Roman faith, the fact that we're good friends to have, then we need to go and prove this. That's fine, but Adminius had come before, other leaders have come in the decades before this. Augustus mentions them arriving, and it hasn't provoked a Roman invasion. Strategic, is there a strategic reason? Did they need to conquer Britain to secure control of Gaul? You know, Julius Caesar emphasises the links between the Gauls and the Britons, says that the Britons have helped the Gauls in war against him, though he doesn't really specify when and how. The Druid, you know, there doesn't seem to be much connection. The Druidic connection, which Caesar emphasises, that the sort of heartland, the centres of learning, of spirituality for the Druids were in Britain. Under Augustus and Tiberius, the Druids have become a suspected cult, an outlawed cult, increasingly in a way. Caesar doesn't really present them in a particularly negative way, or as that important. He certainly doesn't present them as his enemies. Many scholars were inclined to do so, partly because in AD 60 the Romans send this expeditionary force under Suetonius Paulinus to Mona, to Anglesey, the centre of the cult, and destroy the shrines, massacre as many Druids as they can find, all that sort of thing. So it's perceived, well, they're the enemy. You know, they realise this, so therefore they're even more opposed to the Romans, and the Romans perceive them as an enemy. There isn't a lot of evidence for that. To push the Druids into this big role does seem to be an exaggeration. Perhaps there is that feeling coming back to the original thing that it's good for Roman faith if you do protect your allies, but again, they tend to do it, sometimes they think it's essential, but more often they do it when it's convenient for other reasons. So, on the political aspect, is there a sort of political strategic reason for it? One theory was that they wanted to break up troop concentrations on the Rhine. You've had attempted rebellion against Claudius by Scribonianus in Dalmatia in 42. Legio 7, Legio 11 remained loyal. They didn't follow the governor against Claudius. They refused to march and were given the title Claudia Pia Fidelis, Claudius's own pious and faithful, as an honour for this loyalty. But the thing is, there's also the idea Caligula has created two new legions, 15th and 22nd Primigenia, for his planned invasion of Britain, it's assumed, but that doesn't happen, so you've got more troops than you need, why don't you do something with them, or you've got a concentration. The thing is, most of the troops for the invasion actually come from the Rhineland rather than the Danube, so it does seem a little excessive to say, well, I've just got too many soldiers, I better send them somewhere to keep them busy. Important, though, the concern of the threat of usurpers, of challenges from within, was for Romans, for Roman emperors. So it had meant that there was perhaps a bit of a concentration of troops on the Rhine, but again, this is a big empire. There were plenty of other places you could send them. So only 3 out of the 4 legions come from the Rhine, the other one from Pannonia. Profit, was it seen as something that would be very valuable as an asset to the empire? There are rumours of the wealth of Britain, the mineral resources of Britain. Caesar was supposed to have been lulled in part by these to go there, but been rather disappointed at what he found. Cicero jokes about, well, we get slaves from Britain, but I can't see them being well-educated ones, artists, musicians, scribes, this sort of thing. This is not the place to get that. So people perhaps have realised that it isn't this fabulously wealthy place. You also have Strabo, who wrote early on in Tiberius's reign, who said that, well, we've been to Britain, but maybe it would take a legion and its auxiliaries to take the place, but it wouldn't be worth it because the cost of maintaining the garrison would be more than any revenue. Therefore, it's better just to trade with them, dominate them from a distance. So they are capable of these cost-benefit calculations. This is something we'll come back to in the ongoing series on grand strategy. And while the Romans obviously profited from their empire and from conquest, it was rarely the principal reason for taking anywhere was just to get the money. And if it was considered a bad thing. So Crassus's greed is criticised for, it's allegedly the reason for his intervention in Parthia, that he's after the money and the wealth. You have the first contact and first friction, rather, with Mithridates of Pontus, provoked by the greed of Roman senators on the spot, who die and get punished for this. So unlikely. Purely maybe a factor, but it's unlikely to be the deciding thing. So is there a personal political element for Claudius? Bear in mind, this is Claudius, the man who's been found hiding behind a curtain by the Praetorian guards in the aftermath of the murder of Caligula. Not had a public career at all. His father was a great soldier, his brother was a great soldier, his uncle Tiberius was a great soldier. The family, the Claudians, can boast a long line of successful men who'd won triumphs, been governors, this sort of thing, for generations. So it's a famous military family, but he is not directly part of that tradition. So is this an emperor who needs to prove himself? In the same way that Caligula went out in all his slightly eccentric ways to talk about a campaign against Britain, campaigning beyond the Rhine, whatever form it actually took. Your imperator, your victorious general, is one of your titles. Do you need to prove that? Particularly for somebody like this, who drools, who stutters, who's been considered an idiot, the least likely man, now quite old, to be the emperor, to be the princeps. He doesn't have the reputation of Augustus that Augustus proved during his reign and beforehand, that Tiberius had already had before he became emperor. And again, we know that subsequently there'll be lots of non-military emperors, but the only precedent before this is Caligula, and that's not a good one, given what happened to him. So does Claudius need military glory? And Britain offers an opportunity for this. You've got the appeal for aid. It's self-contained. The war shouldn't spread any further. And it's got the mystique of being Britain, this strange place that's not quite in the real world. But also Julius Caesar went there. You could finish off what Julius Caesar started, and that's a good association in terms of glory. And he will make great play of this. He calls his son Britannicus. He builds a triumphal arch. Messalina, his wife, gets associated in the triumph. The triumph is on a grand scale. So there's more to be said for that personal element, that Claudius needs glory. This is a good opportunity for that. And that you can easily rationalise, well, this is good for the empire as well. Maybe it'll bring profit, maybe it'll make us more secure. It adds to our majesty and our imperium, the sense people have of our power, reliability as allies. Perhaps reinforce that deep down he believes that this is what a Roman with power ought to do, because he's an aristocrat from a very old aristocratic family, patrician family. This is what they do. So lots of things may have come together to encourage Claudius to do this. Whatever the specific reason the invasion happens, there are problems at the start. There is disquiet, mutiny, suspicion amongst the men. They don't want to go. They're frightened of crossing the channel. So even when the army's concentrated, they get a bit fed up. So again, we've only got Dio's account. It'd be lovely to have Tacitus for this. And Claudius sends one of his freedmen who addresses the soldiers, goes up on the rostra, and they they cry out, Yo Saturnalia, the Saturnalia, the festival, the winter festival, where for a day slaves and masters would change places, though knowing they would go back to the ordinary relationship afterwards, so you couldn't go too far. The mutiny, if that's what it was, breaks down in laughter and they obey, but they're delayed by this, they're delayed by weather. The invasion force is big. You have 4 legions, 2nd Augusta, 9th Hispana, the 14th Gemina or Twin, and the 20th probably doesn't have the title Valeria Victrix at this point. Like the title Martia Victrix given to the 14th, this might well come from Nero after the defeat of Boudica's rebellion. There might be detachments from other legions. There are some hints of this. There are auxiliaries. There are the fleet. You're talking 50,000 men, perhaps, if these things are anything like at full strength, which they might well be boosted to for a major expedition like this. Out of a Roman army that's 300,000, 350,000. There are 28 legions in existence, and you're sending 4 of them off to Britain plus auxiliaries. So this is a big, big effort. They land at Richborough, possibly at a couple of other sites. Dio talks about them sailing in 3 detachments, 3 columns, 3 flotillas. So maybe they landed in 3 places, maybe they concentrated. At Richborough, you clearly have a very early base. You've got the traces of the ditches and rampart. I'm not sure that I'll be able to find I have got photographs of it, I know, and I remember filming there for a documentary series years back. I can't remember that. I can't seem to find those. So if they turn up, otherwise, if I can find a Wiki Commons or something like that, I'll put it in. Later on, there'd be a big monument that was sort of welcome to Roman Britain, this sort of slightly weirdly shaped arch that then led you on the road north. So Richborough does seem to be significant from very early on. The first target is the tribal confederation, the Cacciavelloni Trinovantes. That's the big enemy. They supposedly had been waiting for you. They'd heard rumours that this invasion was coming, but when there's the delay, like most armies, particularly tribal armies, everybody goes home. They can't stay there for a long time and feed themselves. These are not professional soldiers, and there's not the logistics base to support them either. So you get Caraticus and Togodumnus are each defeated separately in engagements about which there's no real details. There's a battle fought over 2 days at a river line. Again, they try to defend a position like that, which is fairly common for these armies. They have a sense of this is where the Romans have got to go, let's meet them there, let's use the terrain to our advantage. But the accounts are pretty stylized. You have the story of Germanic auxiliaries, Celts, probably Batavians, swimming their horses across the river to surprise the Britons. It's usually associated with the River Medway, and that's probably the best case can be made for that, but it all depends on where they started and which way they're going. Somewhere near the Thames, Aulus Plautius, the commander, the senatorial legatus in charge, stops and sends word to Claudius, who's waiting in Gaul, who comes to join them for the march on Canulodonum, Colchester, which is stormed or submits. There's a triumphal entry. One of the late source claims Claudius brought elephants with him, probably to ride on and look impressive rather than necessarily war elephants, but again, the details aren't there. Claudius then returns to Rome and holds a formal triumph, and he's in Britain for less than 2 weeks, 10 days or so. But he is in there at the kill, and that again emphasises the personal element of this campaign. He wants to be associated with this victory. And it's at Canulodonum where you get mass submission, hints of this in the fragment of the inscription for his triumphal arch that remains, of submission of kings and rulers, quite probably including Boudica's husband Prasutagus and others. As wherever the Romans go, substantial numbers of people never fight them at all. They submit because they see the Romans as a big, helpful friend against the neighbours that you've hated and you've fought against for generation after generation. They're the big threat, not the Romans. In some cases, as with the Iceni, they'll change their mind about this, but other people don't. The Doboni and others, they seem to never really fight the Romans in any, there's not much evidence for it. So some people welcome the invaders because they see them as a big, strong friend. From 43 to 47, you get a sort of general expansion up to the line, Lincoln, Gloucester, what will later become the Fossway, one of these Roman roads. And people used to talk about the Fossway frontier and all this sort of thing. It's not really quite how it works. It's not the line in the sand they've drawn, but it's a convenient route along which they put bases. And there is a notable thing in that you fight the Cacciavoloni Trinovantes on the whole concentrated, because this is a big political group that can raise large armies. After that, the impression is that each of the four legions breaks up and operates as a battle group with auxiliaries on its own. So, for instance, Vespasian with Legio II Augusta, he's the legatus, this is the future emperor, this is his sort of first big military role where he has an independent command, is credited with taking the submission of the Isle of Wight, Vectis, and of two tribes, probably the Durotriges Dumnoni, and certainly capturing lots of oppida, word that's often used for wall towns, hill forts, this sort of thing. And you've got the evidence at Maiden Castle, at Hod Hill, probably it's there in some of the other sites that haven't really been excavated. Places like Hambledon Hill, like Maiden Castle, are so huge that it would take years and a lot of luck to find anything if it's well preserved. You've got the excavations at Danebury as well. There's another caught up in that area. At Maiden Castle, you've famously got the skeletons with wounds on them. The one chap has an arrow in his spine. Sometimes that's described as a ballista bolt, but it's actually, you look closely at it's in Dorchester Museum now, it's an arrowhead. However, there is one skull with a square sectioned hole punched in it that does, that looks like a Roman pilum, very clearly. So that's, the Romans were here, shouted out as loudly as you can get. So some arguments this was a tribal war, intertribal war, doesn't really work. Hod Hill the same. Somebody mentioned it in the comments, there's been this theory that it's a training site and all that sort of thing. I think the evidence to me reads most naturally as a genuine siege, and the establishment of a small Roman garrison in a section of it afterwards. So you get these operations. Caraticus, one of the leaders of the Cacciavoloni and Trinovantes, is still around. His brother Togodumnus has been killed in the fighting, probably anyway. But you get, Cogidumnus and these other people who appear on inscriptions. People who've decided that the Romans are actually a really good deal. Let's join with them. Whoever's living at Fishbourne is presumably in that category. Some of the other villas that crop up early on. Caraticus has gone to what's now South Wales. He's been accepted as at least a war leader, someone to follow by the Silures, this tribe that Tacitus describes as looking a bit different from the other Britons. And partly he had a sort of skewed sense of geography. He thought southwestern Britain was near Spain, and that therefore that explained why the Silures, to his mind, looked like Spaniards. He describes them as dark curly hair, this sort of thing, smaller than other Iron Age tribes of Britain. And you can't have, I live here, you grow up, there's an awful lot of people in South Wales that are short, stocky, quite dark complexion, dark hair. So it fits. On the other hand, there could be other reasons for that, and it's been reinforced by quite a lot of Italian immigrants came here during the late 19th, early 20th century for work, as did so many people. My own family, most of it, there's only a quarter that's Welsh, properly Welsh. The rest came from Dorset, from Devon, from Cornwall, that area, from the southwest of England looking for work. That's where names like Goldsworthy, Coombs, Bruton, my family, they all come from, they're all names from that area. The Bruton origin is probably Breton. So it might be that, the one set you look and think, Tacitus is actually describing how a lot of people look today. On the other hand, there could be other reasons. 2,000 years has passed near enough, so quite a lot of things can happen in that time. They raid the Roman provinces, so they don't just defend against the Romans, they raid into Roman and Roman allied territory. They win several minor victories. Caraticus eventually gets defeated around about 51, when he's moved north to fight with the Ordovicae, one of the other tribes in perhaps mid-Wales, mid to North Wales. Decides to fight a battle in a defensive position, perhaps a hill fort, perhaps an improvised rampart, and the legions and auxilia fight their way up under Ostoria Scapula and defeat him. He flees to the Brigantes. Queen Cartimandua hands him over to the Romans as a good loyal ally. He goes to Rome, is supposed to express, amazement that the Romans have all this, and yet why are you trying to steal our mud huts? This fairly natural reaction. And Claudius spares him. Presumably he lives out his life in comfortable retirement as a hostage guest of the Roman people, the Roman emperor. There's more of a story to tell there, but we don't know. We'd love to know more. Again, the assumption that he might have been executed I've talked about this when I've talked about triumphs elsewhere. Actually, the idea that every triumph ended with the execution of an enemy leader is not the case. The evidence does not support it, or it seems to have been rare, particularly by late Republican empire. So, in many ways, they were quite often pretty generous to defeated enemies, unless they'd done something terrible to the Romans. So, and a useful aristocratic royal hostage with connections was well worth having. So it's not perhaps as surprising, but it's still a good story. The Silures continue to fight, and they win some victories. Ostorius Scapula will die, complaining of his frustration of fighting these, and they take that as a good sign. They badly maul a detachment of Legio 20 that's building a base in their territory. They wipe out 2 auxiliary cohorts, having lured them into an ambush, take the standards, parade them around as a symbol of their triumphs. They keep fighting for a very long time. Suetonius Paulinus mounts a major offensive in 59-ish when he arrives. There's been some fighting before then, interventions perhaps in Brigantia, continued fighting along what becomes the border with Wales. Obviously this is Wales before Wales and before the Welsh, which is the Saxon word for foreigner, is the root of that. Suetonius Paulinus strikes at Anglesey. He marches through Wales, attacks the Druids you have, cross the Menai Straits. There's some hesitation, the sight of all these wild-looking people, women appear like furies, Druids calling out curses on them. It's supposed to make the Romans hesitate, till something breaks the spell. They go forward and they slaughter them, before he is recalled by news of the rebellion of Boudica. One thing to note, he probably doesn't spend more than a few days or perhaps a few weeks in Anglesey, which means that the scale of devastation and the casualties of conflict is limited. It's an island, but it's not that tiny. It's a biggish place. But anyway, that brings us on to Boudica.
So the story of Boudica is intensely dramatic, and unsurprisingly it's attracted a fair bit of attention, at least in Britain, over the years from on-screen adaptations. But unfortunately, it's never really been one with a big enough budget or a good enough script in combination. So there have been some pretty strange ones, or just ones that look rather threadbare. There was one on Netflix not too long ago where a lot took place in woods because they clearly didn't have very many extras. So the trees could conceal the fact that there weren't actually large armies or crowds or people there. Boudica was married to Prasutagus, a king probably, rather than the king of the Iceni. And he submitted early on, probably in that grand submission to Claudius at Canidonum in 43 itself, and appears then to have been a staunch ally of Rome. When he died, he presented a will where he bequeathed his personal property, perhaps rather than his kingdom, though possibly both, jointly to his daughters, we assume at least 2 because the word is plural, and to Nero. It's about this time Nero is the emperor. Now, if you look more broadly, the status of king and friend of the Roman people, an allied king, the client king, as we would call it in the modern era, particularly from Augustus onwards, this didn't include, as a matter of routine, the ability to pass your throne on to anybody else. You could say, this is my heir, this if I want to, but then it was up to the Romans to decide whether or not they passed that status on. So it wasn't a grant in a hereditary sense to your family. A few kings were given the right of choosing their successor. In most cases, it was made more clear that you've got to come to Rome. Now, that's probably more true of the East, where different dynasts pop up and get given regions that don't have that much coherence as kingdoms. I mean, Herod's extended family pop up in various places for quite a while throughout the Julio-Claudian period and a little bit beyond. So it might be there's a misunderstanding from the point of view of Prasutagus that in fact he doesn't have this right as far as the Romans are concerned, something he would consider to be utterly natural. Something else does appear to be going on at the same time as well, in that a lot of senior Roman investors like Seneca, influential men, have made loans, as they see it, to aristocrats in Britain and are now calling these in. Now, it might be that there was talk early on in Nero's reign, or fairly early on, of whether or not to pull out of Britain, or perhaps to reduce the province to a smaller size. There may be the thinking that actually, going back to the sort of cost-benefit calculation that actually we're spending so much on the troops we need to station there, we're not getting very much back, it isn't worth it. We could dominate from beyond. Again, not knowing the detailed circumstances as to why Claudius invades, it's very difficult to move much beyond speculation. And you've also got to say, well, is it okay for Nero to give up territory that his adopted father, his predecessor, has taken? So debts seem to be called in. It might be that plenty of locals didn't understand this. You could have interpreted this as gifts rather than something where you're obliged to pay back with interest. On the other hand, look at any period of history, and today people have taken out loans that they can't actually meet. And the number of people who've got credit card debt these days, and it keeps on going up month by month because they've spent more than they realistically can pay back. So there are tensions within the wider community that don't help. In Boudica's case, Decianus Catus, the procurator of the province, turns up and arrives wanting to claim Nero's Caesar's share of all of this. Procurator is not a senator, he's an equestrian, and he has a role similar to the quaestor of a proconsul in the Republic, in that he's the deputy and the financial official, the overseer, particularly of the imperial property, imperial estates, which obviously in a will, that means it's going to be quite substantial, that's going directly to Nero. And there are imperial territories, imperial lands in virtually every province, and very large ones in, say, Egypt. But there's also an element whereby there's now two different routes to the emperor of information, so that a procurator can keep an eye on the senatorial governor as well. Catus only appears in this incident. We don't know who he was before this. Obviously he's an equestrian, he's had an equestrian career. We don't know what happens to him afterwards. He flees to Gaul when things really flare up, but we never hear of any punishment in the surviving sources, even though he's clearly presented in a very negative way by both Tacitus and Dio. So Catus turns up and starts to collect what certainly what the locals consider far more than his fair share, and treating them with contempt, treating them brutally. Boudica protests, she gets publicly flogged, her daughters are raped. Basically the group of troops and slaves, freedmen with the procurator run amok, as does the procurator himself. So this is, from the Roman sources, clearly presented as an official misbehaving in a big way that lines him up with people like Verres and other people who'd abused their power in the Republic. He does this and then disappears, goes back. Boudica, understandably upset, raises rebellion. Lots of people join her. The Trinovantes to the south are very early converts to the cause, and they have the particular provocation that in the late 40s, an army base at Canulodonum or near there has been replaced by a colony for discharged legionaries, veteran soldiers who've been settled down there, and the land they're given to farm is obviously land that's been taken from the local population. They clearly swagger about, upset people. You've got this, the law will favour them, everything will favour them. The odds are they're acting very much like the conquerors, which of course, as far as they're concerned, and in practicality they were, and upsetting the locals. So the Trinovantes hate them, and plenty of them quickly join Boudica, and this is the first target of the rebellion. Now the city doesn't have any walls because none had been thought necessary. It does, however, have a very large temple of Claudius, the divine Claudius, who'd been, in regions like this before he died, had been deified. And that obviously the cult has been promoted even more since then as part of the broader imperial cult. The former soldiers who are there arm themselves as best they can. Again, they do at least have experience with weaponry, but they send for help. Suetonius Paulinus has gone off to attack Anglesey, the island of Mona as it's called then, is too far away to reach. Instead, they get to Decianus Catus, perhaps in Londinium, somewhere like that, and he sends a couple of hundred not properly equipped men. It's described as they're not regularly equipped. The probability is these are men detached from their parent units on duty in London. Some of them might be from the governor's guard. There'll be a lot of administrators, clerks, people like that, act as policemen, just general useful people to have around, but they're not a coherent unit. They're not, they haven't been trained for combat, let alone seen combat for some time, and in many cases they probably haven't got their full gear and full kit. So it's improvised. He sent some soldiers, but they're not really a proper viable unit, though in time you might be able to turn them into them, and we don't know how many officers went with them. So these come up to Canulodonum, but the siege doesn't last that long, though the defenders do manage to hold off the rebels for a while. Then they hole up in the temple of Claudius. Now, if you go to Colchester today, you can see Colchester Castle, and if you get down to the basement, you'll actually see the Roman levels, because it's built on the foundations of this temple that was stormed in AD 60. So eventually the rebels basically smoke them out, and they either burn inside or asphyxiate, or they come out and are killed. And when archaeologists excavate within the layer, there is a clear level of ash and destruction that marks the visit of Boudica and her warriors, her rebels. And you find, I remember being filmed, looking at some of this stuff in the museum there, coins and other charred things that just from this level. So it's very, very clear, and it's confirmed abundantly by the archaeology. People used to think that some of the damage on the tombstones of Longinus, for instance, and Facilis at the Centurion came when they were tipped over at that point. But again, might just be accident. They then keep going. Londinium also falls and is sacked, and Verulamium, St Albans today. So 3 big cities and lots of smaller farms, villages, little communities. They're supposed to avoid military settlements and garrisons, not try and attack those, but they basically run amok elsewhere. So a lot of the victims are Britons, but Britons who can be considered to either collaborate or simply belong to a different tribe, a different community to you, so you don't like them anyway in the first place. But there doesn't seem to be much discrimination on the part of the rebels. The losses are very, very large. You get numbers of hundreds of thousands in some of the ancient sources. That may well be exaggerated, but it's a lot. It's certainly bad. The military response, well, the initial one of the couple of hundred men sent by Catus has meant nothing. The next to respond is the commander of Legionatus Hispana, Petilius Cerealis, a name that will figure later on, and also he's a relative of the Flavians, and he suppresses the Batavian revolt after the year of 4 emperors. He responds as any Roman commander should, by gathering whatever men he can get together at quick notice and then marching bold-headed at the heart of the rebellion. We'll come on to this when we look at rebellions in more detail. The idea is that you parade absolute confidence, that you are bound to win because you are Roman, that the rebels have no hope and therefore they might as well give in. It's seizing the initiative, it's trying to dominate the mind, and 8 times out of 10, 9 times out of 10, it seems to work. You're able to intimidate or defeat anyone that you do meet, because again, you're confident, you're the best army in the world, you can take on far greater numbers. In this case, it's the 10 out of 10 occasion when it goes horribly wrong. And the details are lacking. It might be they marched into an ambush. It might be that their camp was stormed. Cerealis and a few of the cavalry get away, but the infantry are largely wiped out. And later on, a couple of thousand reinforcements are sent to replace losses in Britain. So some people have said, well, maybe that's the size of the force that's destroyed, but that's perhaps a bit too simplistic. These are sent from the Rhine legions. So the second Roman army response has been defeated, and this is really the one big military victory where they're actually fighting an organized enemy that Boudica and her rebels win. Otherwise, they're devastating, largely undefended, largely settled territory. Suetonius Paulinus gets the news of this, immediately leaves Anglesey and marches south. He's got most of Legio 14, he's got some of Legio 20, he's got auxiliary troops. All told, he seems to be able to put together 10,000 or a little bit fewer than that. So not a really big army, but nevertheless bigger than anything Boudica's faced so far. He sends orders for Legio II Augusta to join him. They're under the command of their Praetorian prefect. They don't have a legatus there at the moment. He refuses to move. He's probably sort of Exeter area, that sort of thing. At least the main concentration. Now, it might be that he was concerned that if he did move, that his whole region would erupt into rebellion, or it might be that he thinks Suetonius hasn't got much hope, so he's trying to save his boys from that disaster if he can't do anything else. Either way, they don't move, they don't reach Paulinus, and subsequently Poenius Posthumus, this chap, will commit suicide to, for the stain on his own honour and the honour of his legion. Suetonius Paulinus marches towards them. He personally rides on, gets to London, but doesn't have enough troops, so goes back and then rejoins the army. Eventually, he and Boudica clash. There's become this convention to talk about this as the Battle of Watling Street, and we even used that back in Time Commanders, the BBC TV series, using the Rome Total War engine all those years ago, and I've seen it described that way elsewhere. Maybe it's somewhere generally within that region, but that really is quite a jump, and the description is so vague, really, that it could fit any number of sites, and various attempts. Or we found a legionary, we found a Roman temporary camp, and it looks as if there's a regions, sort of the defile that he occupies somewhere nearby, so maybe this is it. Unless there is substantial archaeological evidence at some point that turns up, then I don't think we'll ever know exactly where it was. And I remember talking to a very experienced Spanish archaeologist who's done a lot of battlefield work, and he said, if you find a few weapons, some hobnail boots and a few bits of ironwork, that's not a battlefield. If you find hundreds or more, probably thousands of small finds of one sort or another that are military related, then maybe you've got a battlefield. So, again, a few things doesn't make a battlefield. Paulinus deploys in a position where he can basically shield his fewer numbers. They protect the flanks with the ground and woodland, and Boudica is sort of funneled towards them. This is not an organised army. This is not even the normal tribal levy. This is lots of very angry farmers with some warriors, with some aristocrats and all of that hasn't really had to put together and has come together from all sorts of different tribes. So it's not experienced, and they're really relying on their numbers. In fact, the Romans are able to turn those against them, and they counterattack, they drive into them. We won't go into it in great detail, but the Romans win. They suffer something between 8 and 10% casualties, which is a lot for a victorious army in the ancient world. So the idea this is a walkover is not reflected in the evidence we have. The Britons have brought with them their families in wagons, and a whole line of wagons formed behind the rebel army, so that when they retreat into this, they're crammed up against it, the Romans pursue, and they're supposed to kill everything. The animals, the people, the men, the women, the children, the lot. Now, occasionally people say, well, this shows you just how savage and cruel the Romans are, shows you the ideal result for Roman battle as far as Roman soldiers are concerned. I think one account talked of effortless slaughter of men, women and children as the sort of the good result of a Roman battle. That's not the case. Yes, you want to win and you want to kill the enemy, at least risk yourself. However, you want prisoners under normal circumstances, because human life has value, because you can sell it. And particularly the women, particularly the children, get a very good price as slaves. So you don't normally do this, nor do you kill the animals. This is a sign of an army that's really frightened and going wild. And I think all the stories you have, although no doubt they grew in the telling of the atrocities committed by the Britons during their rampage through the Roman towns earlier on, of torture, of mutilation, crucifixion, impaling, boiling people alive, cutting the breasts off women, sewing them into their mouths, this sort of thing, and then impaling them. They may be exaggerated, but they probably reflect the horror of the situation. After all, this is a war that's been provoked by an atrocity in the first place. Boudica and those around her are understandably enraged by the treatment that they've received at the hand of Catus and his men. And the Trinovantes really hate the occupants of Candidonum, the colonists there. So it spirals out of hand, and you get that atrocity breeds another atrocity and so on, and then the Romans respond. And the Romans are very frightened. There is a real prospect, so it seems, that they will lose the province and that the armies there might get wiped out. Suetonius Paulinus is not expecting to win this battle easily, and his men can see the numbers that they're up against. So I think there's maybe an analogy with 1857, where the Bengal army mutinies and there's massacres of British civilians at Meerut and various places. A lot of the troops involved, probably, if there was some longer term plan for all this, were probably not involved in it. are pretty frightened people because they know that the retribution for this is going to be terrible. So frightened people tend often to get quite vicious. The British are terrified by what's happening because it looks like they're going to be thrown out of India and all killed. You have that anyway, you'd be annoyed at this, but with the Victorian sensibilities about women, children, this sort of thing, when they hear of massacres of that, the Bibi Gar at Cawnpore and all this sort of thing, you respond in kind. So frightened people tend to get angry very quickly, and when they're angry, they tend to get vicious. I think you have a situation rather like that in Britain in 60-61, where the Romans hate the opposition far more than usual. I'm not saying that they're normally nice or kind or merciful, but this is war pushed to an extreme. This is particularly unpleasant warfare on both sides, and for reasons that have simply got out of hand, and a lot of fear on both sides. So Suetonius Paulinus follows up the victory. Boudica disappears soon afterwards. There's one tradition that she goes off and commits suicide, but nobody really knows. We never hear any more of her daughters, for instance. Or the family. She just vanishes. She appears for this moment and then goes. Paulinus carries on the campaign throughout the winter and into the next year. He's replaced fairly soon afterwards, and while there's an element of some ships had been lost, the impression is from Nero sends someone from his household to go and investigate, a man who then dies in Britain, and his tomb, the inscription from it is in the British Museum in the Roman Britain Gallery. But I don't know if I'll flash up a picture if I can find one in my collection. I'm not sure whether I've got one. I know I have taken them over the years, but where it is, goodness knows. So Paulinus is replaced essentially on the basis that there won't be peace while he's here. And it's tempting. I mean, I'm perhaps a little influenced by the old novel Imperial Governor by Shipway, where it is that he's just got to the point where he hates so much. I think an element of that in part as well, obviously the rebellion had occurred under his watch. And even though he'd suppressed it, he'd let this happen, he'd let all this destruction happen, he might be coming towards the end of his term anyway, but there's probably also an element that, from a practical point of view, this is not the man to negotiate a peace. Because in the end, you want the province to continue. There's now no more talk of abandoning. It would certainly look like running away if you do it in the aftermath of this. Therefore, you need to get as many of the aristocrats of the local tribes on your side as possible and convince that staying loyal to the Romans is in their best interest. And Paulinus, by this stage, doesn't seem to be the man to achieve that. His successors do. And you have a settled area. There's no clear evidence for any more major rebellion or problems in southern Britain throughout the remainder of the 3.5 centuries of Roman Britain. There was a theory that came out in the journal Britannia a couple of years back that argued for some problems under Hadrian with rebellion, and it might be right, and I was very tempted to use it in my novels, though timing didn't quite fit the chronology. But it's also, that's one way of looking at the evidence, and it may or may not be right. So it's possible. So there might be some qualification to that, but broadly speaking, this area remains settled throughout the rest of the Roman province, as I say, another 3.5 centuries. There seems to be a lull in the rest of the 60s after this, probably to consolidate and rebuild. Interestingly enough, one of the wooden writing tablets found under the bank building they were constructing in London dates from, I think, the late 60s and is written from London in a very matter-of-fact way. So the community rebuilds, business resumes relatively quickly. Again, 7-8 years isn't much time archaeologically, certainly on a site. It's quite a lot in actual people's lifetimes. The emphasis from then on is on the fringes of the province, to the north and a little bit to the west. After the year of 4 emperors, where Britain is not too directly involved, though troops have gone from Britain, like the 14th Legion that's been given its title Martia Victrix by Nero, like the Batavians who come from Britain with the 14th, take part in the Civil War, then end up taking a major part in the Batavian revolt on the Rhineland. The man who suppresses that is Petilius Cerealis, former legate of Legio IX, and after he's had that command, he is sent as provincial legate to Britain, and he campaigns extensively in what's now the north of England, the area of the Brigantes, this big tribe or tribal confederation, broad group. Some of this is where Cartimandua has been queen, and there may have been, well, there probably have been earlier interventions in the area. opinions divided over the two incidents that appear to be mentioned. Our sources are in fact one incident or two separate ones where she's arguing with her husband Venutius, fighting against him. There's civil war, power struggle, and the Romans send troops to back her and rescue her. Again, it'd be lovely to know more about all of this going on and what the details are of the politics within the tribes, the relationships between the tribes. Cerealis is succeeded in about 74 by Julius Frontinus. He's the man who writes a book about aqueducts and that sort of thing, and also writes one on stratagems, military, and wrote more, but it hasn't survived, unfortunately. He campaigns extensively in what become Wales, particularly South Wales, and is the man who suppresses the Silures and forces them to come to terms with the Romans and accept Roman rule. So you've got some tough campaigning there. So the Silures have lasted and been a problem for the Romans, frequent raiders of the allies of the Romans, the tribes that do settle down, for 25 years or so, quite a long period, 25, nearly 30 years. And that's one of the longest patterns of resistance, but they do succumb at this point. After that, you've got Gnaeus Julius Agricola, father-in-law of Tacitus, the orator, the author, and he campaigns briefly in Wales. There's some problems. You get this pattern in a lot of provinces where trouble often flares up between governors, or when the new man has just arrived, because there's a sense that, well, we don't know who he is, let's try him out. And also, the Romans might be a bit slower to react than they normally would be, or sometimes perhaps there's even that thought, well, the governor's gone, who knows whether another one will come back. He responds, he leads a brief expedition to Mona, to Anglesey. Now, having served as a tribune under Suetonius Paulinus, he's probably been there before. And Agricola is very unusual by the standards of Roman senators that he serves all three of his military commands in Britain. He commands 20th Valeria Victrix at the time of the Year of Four Emperors. Before that, he's been tribune, we don't know in which legion, then he comes back as governor. So in a sense, he's almost a British specialist. And the fact that Vespasian has served in Britain as well might explain why there's more interest in the area, or certainly more knowledge. But they are aggressive. Elsewhere, they're not really pushing out, but here in Britain, they do expand Roman direct control to much more of the island. Agricola will push into what becomes Scotland, and into the Highlands. He'll send a squadron of warships that will sail around the northernmost part of Scotland, confirming that Britain is an island. They thought it probably was, but it might just have been a continent that kept on going. But now they know definitely. You have the Battle of Mons Graupius, maybe 83, 84, different arguments about the dating, which is a big set piece in Tacitus' biography of Agricola, where he defeats a large force of Caledonian tribesmen. They claim about 30,000 or so. Big battle in which the legions stay in reserve. It's won by the auxiliary infantry and the auxiliary cavalry, who then go out to pursuit. And the Romans seem to be planning to stay at least a fair way up. So you have the legionary fortress at Inch Tuthill being built. You have forts at the mouths of many of the glens, what will turn into what we know as the Gas Ridge line. Agricola leaves about 84, and then within a few years they pull back. Inch Tuthill is abandoned before it's actually complete, so they haven't built all of the internal buildings. The Gas Ridge forts stay a little bit longer, but are then also abandoned. And this seems to be Domitian having different priorities, but also a crisis on the Danube. There have been problems with the Dacians, Sarmatians and others, several defeats there. One of the Moesian provinces is raided, a governor or a legionary commander is killed. Later on, a Praetorian prefect is given command of an army. Cornelius Fuscus, he goes and gets himself killed and a lot of his army with him. So there are bad things happening there from the Roman point of view. Now, 4 legions had invaded Britain. Nero, after Boudica's rebellion a few years later, had pulled 14th Gemina back to use it, along with the Batavian auxiliaries that came with it, as part of a nucleus for an expedition that never happens, and then it gets caught up in the Civil War. After the Civil War, Legio Secunda Jutrix comes to Britain, therefore restoring the garrison to 4 legions plus auxiliaries, and that's the force that Cerealis, Frontinus and Julius Agricola have in their campaigning. But fairly soon afterwards, perhaps to tie in with the abandonment of Inch Tuthill, though they may not have been there, but a legion was, Secunda Jutrix goes, And then at some point in the early 2nd century, something may happen to Ninth Hispana. It may get taken away from the province. There is an impression of reduction. By the early part of the 2nd century, the Romans have withdrawn to the Staingate Road. That's between the Tyne and Solway line, basically the line that will become Hadrian's Wall a generation later. And there's very little left. Tremontium, Newstead stays for a few years, and then that's abandoned as well. Everything much further north has all gone. They're far less ambitious. And from the perspective of locals, you might be thinking, well, they're going. You don't really know how big the Roman Empire is. Locally, you can just see they're in retreat. The garrison's been shrinking. So there is a pattern. We'll look at Hadrian's Wall in one of these other lectures, and we'll look at it in more detail elsewhere and the northern frontier. But that's basically the story of the province to the end of the 1st century. Yes, I suppose we can mention one of the governors is replaced by Domitian, forced to kill himself because he's allowed, his name was Lucullus, and he's allowed a lance, new type of lance pattern to be named Lucullan after him, and that's considered a bad thing. And there's an interesting inscription that could be interpreted as his bodyguard unit, which may have been the unit issued with these things, turns up as a distinct, almost a sort of punishment battalion serving elsewhere on the Danube a little later on. But anyway, that's a tangent that we don't need to follow at the moment. So let's look at the impact of this on the people living there, just briefly, because we'll look at this sort of thing more again in the future. I know I'm always saying that, but I will get to all these points eventually. The tribal structure broadly remains. The Romans rely on it to a great extent, as they tend to everywhere they go. They keep the existing social, political organization and just adapt it to their own usages. So the Romans like cities. They understand this as a concept. It works for their administration, and they want to encourage the aristocracy not to be living up on a hill fort and raiding their neighbours now and again, or worried that the neighbours will raid them, but to come down, become a local magistrate, get involved in the imperial cult, other cults, build things to entertain the wider population, and have courts and all the routine the Romans understand. There's an interesting passage from Tacitus Agricola where he talks about Agricola encouraging them to educate their children in Latin, bring in tutors, learn the law, this sort of thing, buy into the Roman system, become part of the imperial elite, and then who knows what the possibilities are in the future. So, it's build villas, build bathhouses, build theatres, build grand buildings and temples in your towns, this sort of thing. Tacitus, rather, in one of these tart comments, which he's, characteristic of him, the Britons talked of these things as civilization when they were really just a feature of their enslavement. But in a sense, there's aspects of both of this. It is in part about the Romans controlling you, but it also means that they're saying, well, look, here are all these great things the empire offers, you can have them. And you don't have much choice about it because the Roman army is here and it's pretty good at fighting people. Many of these cities, it varies. You have also the small towns of Roman Britain, that archaeological term where there are these communities that aren't really big enough to be cities, aren't necessarily tribal centres, but they're dotted around the place. Urbanization works. It doesn't work in quite the same way as it does elsewhere. So you don't get the big cities of southern Gaul or Spain or places like that. But you do get ones that compare favourably with ones of northern Gaul. So it varies a little bit. A lot of Britons, the aristocrats still seem to like living in the country. So they don't switch entirely to an urban lifestyle. And villas, of course, will become a big feature from fairly early on. And it's hard to tell in many of these cases whether you're dealing with an aristocratic family that's always been aristocrats in this region and simply takes on a Roman lifestyle, buys into the Roman system and does well, or whether these are people who've seized the moment, this is their time to take over from the ones who were above them before, become very Roman, get favoured, and therefore become the elite of the tribe, take over. So you have villas. You don't get villas where there are military colonies established. You've not got just Colchester, you've got Lincoln later on, because the land there is being doled out to the former soldiers. But elsewhere, we seem to be spotting more and more further north. I think they're spreading. The really huge ones tend to be later, 3rd century, particularly 4th century, but there's some pretty substantial buildings from fairly early on, dotted around in most areas, certainly areas of good farmland. So a lot of people are accepting this. In other respects, people are still living in their roundhouses in many of the farmsteads, and that British avoidance of villages, that you have your group of family farm, group of huts for a family, extended family farm, and then another one a few hundred yards away, quarter of a mile away, half a mile away, and another one, rather than, you can see each other, but you're not shoulder to shoulder. That seems to stay. But you'll notice that the finds that turn up in these places, there's more and more Roman material, and the quantity of stuff from the Roman period is just much greater than before or afterwards. Far more people lower down the social economic scale are getting access to Roman pottery and other things, metalwork, brooches, things that have been made often a long way away. And those are just the things we can see. So we'll talk more about this aspect of things as we go on. The military presence moves away from the southeast more to the fringes, so a bit in Wales, in the southwest of England, the north more. Over time, the emphasis will be more and more on the north. That's where the bulk of the troops will be concentrated. But you've got big depots at Claudian, Chester, York later on for the three legions. So you have not much sense of there being a major military problem in the southeast, but there again, the army could get there if it needed to. And there are troops in London. There's for some periods you can't trace where the fort is, but the governor tends to be based there rather than in one of the colonies, and he has his singulares, his horse guard and foot guard, drawn from the auxiliary units, plus all the men attached to his staff for administration. So there are 1,000 or so soldiers of one sort or another with the governor. But he might move around. So Britain develops, it takes on aspects of Roman culture. You have developments of sites like Aquasulis in Bath, the springs there where Sulis Minerva, you take a local deity, give them a Roman veneer. This will happen in lots of places. The process is hard to understand, and to what extent it's imposed, to what extent it's the locals sort of saying, well, this is a way of buying into the Roman system, maybe a mixture of both. Britain is Roman for another 350 years. It is a successful province. There's never a senator from Britain that we know of, but nevertheless, it's important, it matters, it prospers. Over time, whether it ever in the early, the first century or so, justified the cost of the army, hard to say. Later on, it probably did. It seems to get more prosperous later on, perhaps because it's a little more secure, also because the garrison's been reduced in size, so you can balance it up that way. Anyway, I think that's probably it for today. We've got other aspects we can look at, but we'll come back to those when we're looking at different themes about frontiers, soldiers, the army, administration, law courts, Romanization, all of these sorts of things. So today this was just an introduction to why and how the Romans conquered Britain and some glimpse of what this meant to everybody there. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching.